Hi, on this episode of History with Me, we're looking at the weird historical stories that sound made up but aren't. There's a big difference between actual historical events and how the general public commonly remembers them. It works kind of like a game of telephone. Starts with a simple fact like, Benjamin Franklin once performed a kite experiment to study the electrical properties of lightning. As the story gets retold and embellished, eventually that story becomes, Benjamin flew a kite into a storm, got struck by a bolt of lightning, and proved electricity existed. Maybe that's more exciting, but that's not accurate. We all know, or think we know, stories from history that are all really more like historical urban legends. If you spent any time trying to investigate the origins of historical stories and found that many of them are exaggerated, you might think that true history is dry and prosaic. But that's not so. Interesting true stories from history can be just as weird as the popular versions we're more familiar with. Here, in my video, are some stories from history that sound so made up or exaggerated but really did happen. Number 1 on today's list is Einstein's brain was stolen and went missing for decades. It might sound like a plot from a sci-fi movie, but Einstein's brain really was stolen shortly after his passing. In the 19th century, the brains of geniuses were often preserved so that scientists could try to determine the origins of that person's intelligence. For example, half the brain of Charles Babbage, inventor of the first computing machine, is still on display at the Hunterian Museum at London's Royal College of Surgeons. Einstein was aware that scientists might want to study his brain after his passing and explicitly forbade it, knowing that such studies really produce useful information. Nevertheless, when Einstein passed at Princeton Hospital in the early morning of 18th of April 1955, the pathologist who examined him, Dr. Thomas Harvey, decided to remove the brain on his own initiative for future study. Dr. Harvey took Einstein's brain home, divided it into 240 pieces, and stored it in 2 mason jars filled with celluloid. Shortly after Einstein's cremation, his son Hans Albert found out about the theft and was furious, but Dr. Harvey convinced him to let him keep the brain. Taking the brain of the world's most famous physicist without permission did have professional consequences for Dr. Harvey. He soon lost both his job at Princeton Hospital and his marriage, then moved to the Midwest where he took several jobs, either practicing medicine or running research labs. He kept Einstein's brain for the next several decades, at one point storing it in a cider box beneath a beer cooler, hoping to unlock the secrets of Einstein's intelligence. The fate of Einstein's brain was mostly unknown until 1978, when a reporter tracked Harvey down in Kansas. Today, what remains of Einstein's brain resides at the Penn Medicine Princeton Medical Center in Plainsboro, New Jersey. Almost nobody is allowed to see it, not even researchers, but many more pieces of Einstein's brain can possibly still be found across America, thanks to Dr. Harvey's habit of giving away pieces of it to curious friends. Second on our list, we have Pope Stephen VI put his deceased predecessor on trial. The story of the Cadaver Synod is kind of like the 9th century version of McDonald's hot coffee lawsuit. On the surface it sounds silly, but once you learn the facts, it actually makes sense. In the 9th century, the Pope had the power to crown the Holy Roman Emperor. This meant that popes were involved with political intrigue, and many of them didn't live long enough after assuming office. Stephen VI's predecessor, Formosus, reluctantly crowned the Duke of Spoleto as the Holy Roman Emperor, and later crowned the Duke's son Lambert in 896. Formosus reversed course and crowned one of his allies, King Ernulf of the East Franks. Shortly after becoming emperor, Arnulf became paralyzed and returned to his native Germany, and Formosus himself perished. When Stephen VI took the papacy, the crowning was still in dispute. Stephen had closer ties to Lambert and wanted to reinstate his ally, and the Cadaver Synod was a means to delegitimize Formosus and all of his decisions as Pope. Stephen ordered Formosus' 9-month-old corpse be clothed and actually brought to the courtroom, and he appointed a deacon to speak on the departed's behalf. During the sham trial, Stephen accused the cadaver of everything from perjury to violating chronological law. Funny enough, what was left of Formosus was found guilty and thrown into the Turbur River, but the trial itself was so controversial that Stephen's reign only lasted a few more months until he was stripped of his papal seal and executed. Third on this list, we have the most kissed girl in the world, who was a 19th century drowned teen whose face was the model for a CPR dummy. During the late 19th century in Paris, a body of a girl presumed to be a teenager who drowned herself was pulled from the Seine River. In an attempt to identify the unknown girl, authorities put her body on display in a mortuary, but no one came forward to identify the teen, who has become known as the unknown woman of the Seine. According to an article in the BMJ, a doctor who conducted an autopsy was struck by a serene look on the girl's face and created a plaster cast, or death mask as they put it, of her countenance. Replicas were made of the mask, which went to become on a model for a CPR dummy's face. In the late 1950s and 60s, when mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and CPR were invented, Archer Gordon of the American Heart Association noticed that medical students who practice CPR could end up hurting each other. So he and another doctor, Bjorn Lind, asked the toy maker to create a mannequin students could practice on. Lerodal had seen a replica of the mask of the unknown woman of the Seine and used it for a female mannequin dubbed Or Annie, because it looked so peaceful and wouldn't be intimidating. According to the Lerodal company, which still makes the mannequins, about 300 million people have been trained using Resus Anne, so she has earned the title of the most kissed girl in the world. Number 4 on this list is the ET video game was so bad that they buried thousands of copies in a landfill. The story of the Atari Et debacle is a classic tale of corporate mismanagement. In the early 1980s, Atari controlled 80% of the $2 billion video game market on the strength hits like Pong, Centipede, and Missile Command. The company had also produced a successful adaptation of Raiders of the Lost Ark, one of the first video game adaptations of a movie, so in 1982, Steven Spielberg approached the company about making an ET video game. Atari president Steve Ross paid $21 million for the rights to the ET game, which meant he would need to sell 4 million copies to break even. In order to pull this off, Atari needed to have the game ready for the Christmas sales season. The problem that Steven Spielberg and Atari made their deal in July of that year, Raiders had taken 10 months to develop, but game designer Howard Scott Warshaw only had 5 weeks to make a viable product. Miraculously, Warshaw finished the game and Spielberg signed off on it, but the designer later called it the toughest 5 weeks he has ever endured. The game hit stores with much fanfare, but gamers soon began complaining about its confusing gameplay system and ET's tendency to fall into holes and get stuck. The game still regularly makes lists of the worst video games ever made. In the end, it only sold 2.5 million copies. With literally tons of unsold copies of ET on its hands, Atari opted to bury them all in the desert in Olomouc, New Mexico. Although Atari tried to keep the dumping quiet, it got reported in the New York Times. However, without the internet to keep it alive, the story faded into memory and eventually became a little more than a rumour. That is, until 2014, when a documentary crew led by filmmaker Zach Penn found the dumping site and excavated it. And last on our list today, number 5. George Washington had entirely false teeth, not just wooden ones. The story that George Washington had a set of wooden dentures is a myth, but the reality of the first president's dental health is arguably much stranger and more upsetting. Washington did suffer from poor dental health for most of his lifetime. Thanks to poor dental hygiene of his era, combined with his genetics, Washington began losing his teeth in his 20s. By the time he was sworn in as president, he had only had one of his original teeth left. During his lifetime, Washington did have several sets of false teeth, but none of them were made of wood. One theory for the origin of the wooden dentures story is that his surviving dentures became stained over time, giving them a wooden look. Washington's first set of false teeth were made from ivory and attached to his remaining teeth with wire. His later false teeth sets were made from lead, gold, and brass screws. Some of his denture sets were made with actual human teeth, and there is evidence he obtained them from his own slaves. In his 1784 ledger, Washington recorded a payment of £6, 2 shillings to his slaves for 9 of their teeth. Thank you for joining today's episode of History with me. If you like this video, please don't forget to comment, leave a like, and subscribe. It would be much appreciated. I'll see you guys in the next video. See you later.